I try to help people understand that they're actually responsible for their own triggers.
Often in a marriage, when we fight, we take things so personally. It's hard not to, but how can couples do a better job of not taking it so personally when they fight?
Actually, fighting is, people think it's taboo, they don't want to do it, but Harville and I think fighting is an opportunity for growth.
Absolutely.
And we say conflict is growth trying to happen. The way I phrase it is conflict is God trying to show up in your relationship, wanting to make a transformation and teach you something and your partner something. A major thing that Harville and I like holding up is that there's a myth in our culture that if you're fighting, you're married to the wrong person. So people get afraid when they're fighting.
Right.
But again, we think if you're struggling with your partner, if you're fighting with your partner, something new is trying to happen.
Right, and something good can happen if you can use that and get closer.
If it's held in the right way,
right,
it can be miraculous what will happen.
Well, I think it's important to remember that you know, when you're interacting with your spouse, a lot of the past experiences influence that. So if we can recognize that, a lot of times, especially when there's a response that's especially exaggerated, I think it's important to remember that it might have more to do with something in the past, a trigger from the past, than it has to do with a spouse, your spouse. So, like for example, like if a man is like really disorganized and he was scolded for that as a child, you know, and he might end up marrying like a real organized list maker, because we oftentimes replicate the patterns from our childhood. And like his wife might say, you know, honey, can you pick up the socks from the floor? And he's like having this big reaction. But if she can remember, it's got nothing to do with her and everything to do with the trigger from the past, that kind of gives it a different kind of perspective.
Absolutely.
I'd love to build on this talk about triggers. I try to help people understand that they're actually responsible for their own triggers.
Amen to that.
Yes, the other person, a loving person who knows what a trigger is, won't pull it. I had a couple I worked with some years ago that actually believed that they were not supposed to trigger one another. And they worked so hard not to trigger one another, they were absolutely paralyzed.
Right, they were on tiptoes, I imagine, the whole time.
Yeah, they of course, except when they burst into
and then it was conflagration.
World War V.
Right.
But,
you know, and as Helen, you were saying, God in the middle of your marriage, that we're really brought together for that conflict to happen. And I often describe with my clients that if you are burning off a field, contained fire, that fire to the soil can bring nutrients.
Oh, wow.
It's green, it's alive, it comes back healthier. And that with the conflict, if you know how to use the conflict, using the Imago dialogue, for example, that you can come together and take that fire, if you will, the conflict, mold, shape, think of things we put under fire, and shape the relationship, but also to bring back new life. And to have a healthier relationship.
It's a bit of going through that crucible as well, right? Absolutely. I mean, it's like that fire can really transform, but it can just be, it can be so hard.
Conflict is growth trying to happen.
Absolutely.
So I think the first thing to manage the trigger is to learn to say, let me see if I'm getting that.
Right.
You really felt that I was attacking you for. Is that it? And just couples have to learn, and I say this, have to deliberately, they have to learn how to respond in their relationships in an intentional way instead of a reactive way. And the other thing that Helen and I have found that works in our relationship beautifully is, again, something that regulates the anxiety reaction in your middle brain, is to become curious. And we use what we call the principle of curiosity.
I love that.
Let me see if I got that. And then to go to curiosity. Is there more about that? Can you say more about what you're feeling and where that comes from? And then mutual curiosity, to say back to Helen, what can you tell me what was going on with you when you said that?
Right.
That made me feel like you were criticizing me
Right.
in some way. The curiosity, people say, well, it shows that you're interested in me, not in you. And when you become interested in me, then I feel safer with you.
That makes sense. So this has been a great discussion. I think Helen summarized it best by saying when you fight with your spouse and you tend to take it personally, to really be thinking and using as a framework the idea of going from judgment to curiosity as a powerful way to transform the fighting and the conflict into an opportunity to really transform and get closer as a couple.